So reading Mkrtich Armen's novel Yerevan in the context of Soviet national policy. This novel was published in 1931 for the first time in Armenian in Moscow. In 1933, on November 18, the decision of November 14 of the Communist Party board, and one of the decisions to discard Mkrtich Armen's book Yerevan because it preaches local nationalism and advocates for orientation towards feudal East. Several years later, in 1937, Armen, along with many representatives of intellectuals, was arrested, and Yerevan is named as one of the anti-Soviet works. He spends years in exile, and then after the war he is rehabilitated and returns to Armenia, but none of the works has even any close relation to Yerevan. The Yerevan novel is a modernist novel, but others are absolutely in line with socialist realism. And among the Soviet Armenian writers, many of them have been accused or their works have been assessed as, and not many of them have been actually accused of being. Accused for orientation towards the feudal East. If I will try to say that it is a dialogue between the two Soviet architects who are designing the city of Yerevan. One of those protagonists, named Gurgen, positions himself as a defender of Western architecture tradition, and the other one, Ashak, is for Eastern style. Gurgen, the advocate of the Western architect, explains his choice with the imperative of the time, relying on such binary oppositions as present, past, modern, outdated, progressive, backward, or regressive, where the first term stands for the West, the second for the East. A citation from the novel: I get inspired by the last word in architecture, by the civilized West, whereas you by the regressive East. Ashak, the architect fascinated by the East, opposes this dichotomy, considering it as indication of Orientalism. The demolition of the old city to build a new one he interprets as not only the destruction of old non-functional buildings, but as of human relations, social bonds and structures. He proposes to build Yerevan as the center of a new East, more specifically to build a Soviet East. Another citation: I believe that here in Yerevan should be created a Soviet East. It is interesting that some recent studies of Soviet literature analyze the topos of the East in the context of socialist realism, modernist aesthetics competition. As you remember, I have mentioned that this novel is aesthetic competition, modernist aesthetic competition work. Particularly, I mean two articles, Culture 1.5 and Einstein in Fergana from Avant-Garde to National Form, penned by literary critic Yerevan State, and the paper Orientalism as Modern Oriental Stylization in Soviet Culture 3060s, presented by Ilya Kuklin last year at the conference Post-Soviet Cosmopolis, the Soviet project of world literature and its legacies, developed the idea since 1930s. There were emergent phenomenon of Soviet culture, which can be called Soviet Orientalism. Initially, it was called proletarian culture, put forward by Stalin. This was done under the imperative to reform the cultures, making them national informed and socialist in content. The reformation of Eastern ethnic groups in the Soviet Union mainly led to the exoticization and orientalization of those cultures, but the strangeness of the Orient allowed the modernist valorization of the familiarized forms of to continue its existence in new ways. The national, informed socialist and content formula provided a context in which formal strangeness could re-emerge as a sanctioned entity. Formal experimentation was possible only at the national context and only if a singular socialist content predominated. As such national form was the last sanctuary of modernist strangeness. End of quote. In his presentation, mostly referring to Skakov's article, Kukulin also interprets the usage of Orientalism and exotization as an excuse to circumvent the rules of socialist realism. The analysis of the circumstances and the content of the novel Yerevan allows me to contribute to Skakov's and Kukulin's thesis and to question them simultaneously. The time of writing the novel Yerevan, that is 1927-1931, is a basis for claiming that the exotization of the East in Soviet literature began before the mid-30s, which they argue started at that time. And it would be interesting to investigate whether Armen's novel is unique or it is mere one among other works of art which used the East as a topos before 1932. If it is not the only one, then another question will follow. What was the fate of such works and their authors? These are open questions for further research. Apart from that, I argue that the exoticization and orientalization of the East in the novel Yerevan were not done to circumvent the rules of socialist realism, because the latter began to exist as a clearly defined method direction since 1932 and, and was declared as the official direction of the Soviet art at the First Congress of Soviet Writers in 1934. So, if the theme of East in the novel Yerevan was not a way of resistance to or excuse of not using socialist realism aesthetic, then one should question why did Armen refer to that topic. The novel Yerevan represents a prominent example of Armenian engagement with Korenizatsiya, policy that provides space for national communities in the young Soviet Union. Arshak returns to Yerevan, the novel's protagonist, educated in Leningrad and spent years working on different constructing projects in Moscow. He was sent by the Soviet government to Armenia to take part in a replanning of the capital city. Yerevan is one of the main architects. Such a professional path from center to periphery was not uncommon in the Soviet Union. However, this secondment to periphery is more than career because he is an Armenian and Yerevan is his hometown. The Ashok represented a generation of young specialists from the national republics whose higher education began in the mid 1920s, mostly in the universities of the center, and to enter the professional field of their respective republics in the early 1930s. However, it is noteworthy that there were differences in realizing colonization or indigenization in different republics of the Soviet Union. For example, because the government met difficulties in finding specialists among the natives of Central Asia, they sent specialists from the center who were mostly of Slavic descent. In case of Soviet Armenia, we have a different picture. Armenia produced many of its own Soviet experts, making it a model for the possibilities of colonization policy. Since the 1920s, alongside the preparation of the new specialists, many Armenian professionals from different parts of the former Tsarist Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere had been moving to Armenia to take part in the construction and building of the country. This was not only because of the opportunities the Soviet authorities promised them, but the dream of a state cherished in the national literature since the 19th century, followed by the liberation movements, which was terribly shaken by the Armenian genocide, drove many to Soviet Armenia. One such example is Zabel Yesayan, the Ottoman Armenian female writer, female activist, who settled in Armenia after the destruction of the Ottoman Armenians as a political community, only to perish in the Stalin era purges. She moved to Armenia from Paris. She never imagined that she can perish because of the Stalin persecution. Such professionals arrived in the Soviet Union with a clear sense of national consciousness and the motivation to develop different spheres in the country. The chief architect of the city of Yerevan, Alexander Tamanyan, was one of those specialists who started his career before the revolution and followed the path back to Soviet Armenia, similar to Ashak. Tamanyan was born outside of Armenia in the Russian Black Sea city of Yekaterinodar, modern-day Krasnodar. He was educated at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. After more than a decade of work in different cities of Russia, he moved to the newly established Republic of Armenia and started to work on the urban redesigning of Yerevan. After a year, in 1920, When the nascent Armenian Republic fell to the Bolshevik Revolution, Tamayan had to flee the repressions launched by the new Bolshevik state against Tsarist intellectuals. He crossed the southern border of Armenia and took refuge in Iran out of need for protection. The Soviet government softened its attitude towards such specialists with Tsarist educational background. In 1923, Tamayan was called back to Soviet Armenia and entrusted the position of the main architect of the city of Yerevan, chief architect of the city of Yerevan, and Tamayan presented the master plan to the People's Council a year after his return in 1924, and it was approved. The construction works started, but I'm telling you all this uh, dates so you know that it was written. Yerevan novel was written along with the development of the city. It's kind of semi-historic book. So Tamayan was tasked to revise the plan. He did so in 1934. The construction of his revised plan, named Metz Yerevan, Greater Yerevan, began. The composition of the novel and the construction of the city of Yerevan took place simultaneously. It is not difficult to note the similarities between the biographies of Tamayan and novel's protagonist Arshak. Both got their architectural education in Petersburg, Leningrad. Both started practice their profession in Russia. Both were engaged by the Soviet government in the ambitious replanning of the city of Yerevan. In addition, Arshak alludes to Yerevan's eastern past under Iranian rule, introducing another parallel between the fictional architect and the experience of Tamayan. Short exile in Iran, Mkrtich, Armen, a witness of the city construction process, also followed the debate on the problems of architecture, not only in Armenia but all over the Soviet Union, which centered on finding an architectural style that was national, informed, socialist in content. Those debates are also included in the pages of Yerevan, illustrating how the novel was deeply rooted in the political context. One of the novel's poetical refrains, ancient centuries-old Yerevan is dying, might seem to be a mere indication of fictional characters' melancholy, but that is not so. When we read Tamanyan's report on the planning of Yerevan, where he presents the principles of the city reconstruction, and the justification for that, we see that the demolition of the old city was not accepted unequivocally, and Tamanyan has to explain. If we ask ourselves whether there has been a case when it was allowed to change the shape of a city by demolishing the old one, the answer is ready. And there is a lot of literature about it. There is no a single city in Europe that has not been subjected to such situation. 100 years ago, a century ago, Paris was fundamentally changed. A quarter of it has been demolished and rebuilt with a completely new style, new parks, wide streets, squares, etc. The same can be said for Berlin, London, Vienna, Rome, and other great cities. Damayan refers to the experience of great European cities and calling to use their experience. Tamanyan probably refers to the early 19th century when the neoclassicism dominated in European architecture. The neoclassical forms were harshly criticized by the constructivists who were against any kind of decorative elements, instead offering laconic and functional forms. After the October Revolution, constructivism, as other avant-garde art trends, developed and flourished in the Soviet Union as a direction of proletarian futuristic art. Nevertheless, from the early 1930s onward, when the mainstream view of the art changed in the Soviet Union, all innovative and experimental methods began to be interpreted as bourgeois formulas. Constructivist forms in architecture replaced by such forms which experts later would classify as Stalinist neoclassicism. In the novel, Yerevan Armen stages a lengthy debate between constructivist and neoclassicist, which is represented as an East-West civilizational debate. The West representative character Gurgen, in a sense, follows the steps of Alexander Tamayan. Here is our teacher. The West, here is the huge storehouse or warehouse from which we must take whatever is possible, whatever is not rotten yet. However, Arshak, the character representing the East, challenges Gurgen, imputing to this perspective the defining features of constructivist architecture. Can you imagine the Yerevan you want to build? Cubic rooms, orbital lamps, square walls, round windows, everything is based only on the principle of vertical and horizontal lines and on circle. Arshak posits his city plan as a way to save and develop the culture of diversity, while his opponent's plan he interprets in the frames of culture of standards. This is also a constructivism concept. All these arguments about architectural forms and styles between Arshak and Gurgen, however, are not formulated under the names of any art movement or direction such as constructivism or neoclassicism in the narration. Rather, The controversy between those directions is used by the author to create the East-West debate, where neoclassicism is held under the East, while constructivism is under the West. As much as the novel reflects the image of its time, we cannot demand valid accuracy from it precisely because it is a fiction, not historiography. So it is important to analyze the choice of symbols. Those are not unfamiliar and accidental for those who have dealt with the Armenian issues. It should be noted that during the late Tsarist and early Soviet periods, a prominent linguist and archaeologist Nikolai Mar puts forward a theory according to which Armenian culture is a synthesis of Eastern and Western culture. According to him, the Indo-European people of Phrygia moved to the east, where they met the Yaphanite people from Uratria, Nairi, and the fusion of these two cultures formed the basis of the Armenian culture. Thus, we can say that Mkrtich Armen's novel Yerevan is just one example of fictionalizing the narrative about Armenia. Armenians as a bridge between East and West, an idea which was circulated by the Soviet historiography under the authoritative patronage of Nikolai Mar. But at its core, the novel opposed to the notion of the nation as an objective and relatively stable community. Here, we would like to remind Stalin's formulation of the nation, which he gave in his pamphlet Marxism and the National Question in 1913 before the revolution, which then became a cornerstone in the process of developing Soviet national policy. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. I have presented the word stable in bold to show how the whole emphasis of the novel contradicts to it. Returning to the novel's main protagonists, Ashak Budagyan's wanderings through the narrow streets, gardens, memories, and dreams, his relations with the other characters of the novel are metaphorical images of the disclosure of his identity, which show that any identity is multi-layered and any concrete formulation can be short-term and deceptive. For example, one of the techniques used in the novel is the play of dual characters or mirror effects, through which the Ashak-Gurgen pair can be interpreted not only as a dispute or conversation between the East and the West, but also as a narrative of identity's duality. It seemed to him that there were not two architects standing face to face each other, but only one who shook hands with his own image reflected in a mirror. Another example, Ashak Budarian has a cousin with the same name and surname in Yerevan whose regular appearances in the novel also aim to construct a narrative to identify searching hesitation about himself. It seemed as if he had lost himself and was calling himself in the darkness. To conclude, the novel's non-linear narrative and the possibility of various interpretations given to the reader contradict not only to the aesthetics of the socialist realism, which became mainstream in 1932, but also the Soviet concept of the nation, which demanded the construction of the stable identity. Thank you, Sona.